Welcome to Philosophy in a Nutshell, our Classics Unraveled vanity project where we pluck Western wisdom out of the clouds and pin it down on Earth for regular folks. I'm John Christensen, and today we talk about Aristotle. Aristotle's story begins at the same place we left off, in the Academy of Plato. He was a student of Plato, and a lot of what Aristotle has to say is a response to what he learned there in the Academy. But eventually he went back home to Macedon, where he famously instructed Alexander the Great, and along the way developed a new philosophy of his own. He even founded his own school, the Lyceum. But unlike the Academy, which survived well after the golden age of the Greeks, the Lyceum was destroyed when the Romans eventually conquered Greece under the hand of Sulla. Despite the destruction of the school, and despite the disappearance of Aristotle's works from the West, the eventual recovery of his works became the foundation for Western philosophy almost in its entirety. Unlike Plato, Aristotle provides us not with dialogues, not with these dialectical conversations between characters to provide relatively easy on-ramps to philosophical ideas. Instead, Aristotle provides us with treatises, long-form books that treat a topic of some weight and of some length from its very beginning to its absolute conclusion. However, we should be able to plot a course through these vast waters by beginning at the nucleus of being, by identifying what his principal philosophy is of metaphysics. Then we can move on to his description of people and of how they ought to behave in his ethics. And finally, we'll see how those people interact with each other in his politics. Our first step is to identify the chief difference between Aristotle and his teacher. Whereas Plato gives us his theory of the forms, these abstract principles that exist in a superior transcendental realm in which we only participate imperfectly, Aristotle has his theory of essence and substance. Aristotle's essences are similar to forms in that they're what makes a thing what it is. However, instead of existing in some hyper-real, possibly metaphysical realm, separate from the things that participate in it, an essence is something that only dwells within each of its physical substances. In other words, humanity is something that is within me, it's in my cameraman, and it's in you. But to say that humanity, that shared humanity that we have, also exists in some airy, metaphysical way elsewhere, in the realm of the gods, perhaps, is something that Aristotle considers unnecessary. Essences are no less real than Plato's forms. It simply means that there's no such thing as humanity that isn't inside of a human. There's no such thing as life outside of living things. As for substance, Plato's substances are physical things that imperfectly participate in those metaphysical forms. Aristotle's substances are the fusion of a form, that being the shape something takes, and matter, that being the stuff that thing is made out of. So to summarize, essence is the property or properties that make something what it is, and substance is that property or those properties joined with reality. Or take apples. The essence of an apple is the property or properties that make an apple an apple. But the substance of an apple would be an apple, right? An actual apple, or all apples. Now, not all properties are essential. Not all properties make a thing what it is. Some properties could be removed, and the thing continues to be what it is. We call those properties accidental. Let's take an apple again. An apple is a fruit. That's necessary. That's essential to its definition. So an apple that is not a fruit is not an apple. Whereas the color of an apple is not especially important to making it what it is. We would say that apples come in a range of colors, but that it should be red, for example, and then change to green doesn't change it from being an apple into something else. Therefore, that would be an accidental property. Some properties are not so clear. For example, we typically say an apple would have seeds, right? But would a seedless apple continue to be an apple if it's made up of something different? Or how about this? Apples typically grow off of an apple tree. But what if we mechanically built an apple in a laboratory? Would that be an apple? Or how about this? An apple is something that, if you plant it in the ground, will typically grow an apple tree. And if you don't, it's something you can eat. But does an apple that never gets planted, or an apple that never gets grown, does that count as an apple? Those final questions lead us to Aristotle's final distinction, those being potential properties and actual properties. A potential property is something that an object can be or can do. An actual property would be something that an object is or does. The essence of an arrow, for example, is that it's something you fire from a bow to strike a target. Now, is it still an arrow before you fire it? Is it still an arrow after you fire it? Aristotle says yes. That essential property of being fired from a bow is actual when it's in the middle of its flight, but it's potential before its flight, after its flight, and for that matter, even if it never gets used. The essence of a thing permits that whatever capabilities it has may be realized or unrealized at any particular time in its life. Maybe you noticed that the properties we were assigning to arrows and apples were not all alike. We defined an apple as a fruit. It's very definitional. And we defined an arrow as something to be shot from a bow. That's very active. These kind of properties need to be distinguished in terms of their kind, and Aristotle does so in his Metaphysics. So, big title card, Metaphysics. Yeah. Aristotle identifies 4 causes that cause something to be what it is. The first 2 causes we've already discussed. We have our formal cause, which would be literally the form it takes, the shape it takes, and the material cause, the physical stuff that it's made of. The third cause would be the thing or things that actually brought it about in time. So an apple's efficient causes would be an apple tree, and the soil and water and sunlight. The final cause, which is actually called the final cause, is the object or goal accomplished by the object. This goal of the final cause, which in Greek is the telos of the object, is perhaps the most important thing to look for in defining an object's essence, because whereas the other 3 causes describe what a thing is, the final cause describes what a thing is for. The material, formal, and efficient causes make something itself. The final cause makes it good. Good isn't a word we've used in our philosophy yet, but it's important. It allows us to apply value judgments to the things we talk about. We all know what a guitar is, and all of its attributes suit a guitar for what a guitar is for, which is music. And so whatever its form, whatever its material, whatever its efficient cause, all those things contribute towards making it good at playing music or bad at playing music, or to use somewhat more Aristotelian terms, to make it suited or not suited for playing music. A guitar that's not suited for playing music is a bad guitar, and one that is well suited for playing music is a good guitar. The same could be said of a guitar player. A person who does not have the skill that suits him for playing the guitar is not going to be a good musician, whereas one who does have the skills that suit him for playing the guitar will be a good musician. Now, this telos or end-oriented philosophy might seem antithetical to what we've talked about before. How can a thing's end be its beginning? How can what a thing is for inform what a thing is? All of our previous philosophers were concerned where things come from, and so this where it's going is a new element. However, the fact that there is a future-headedness to all of Aristotle's essences should not make us worry, because, again, those properties can exist potentially and actually, and that means that when a thing is created, the fact that it hasn't accomplished its goal is irrelevant to whether it exists or not, because that final cause merely exists potentially. A guitar is definitely a guitar, regardless of whether it's been played yet. And a musician is a musician long before he's particularly good at what he does. I can't help but take small aside to point out that I use that word made. Again, a guitar is made. But is a man made? Is a world made? When we say that something is made for a certain purpose, does that imply intent? Does the telos of an object presume a creator? Well, depends on who you talk to, but Aristotle certainly believed in a divine first mover. And in fact, it's in his Metaphysics that we get the first formulation of a logical argument for the necessity of a divine creator. This is called the cosmological principle, and it will continue to be used by folks, pagan and Christian, for many, many, many centuries. The idea is this: all things that exist, all things that are real, are either necessary, they need to exist, or they are contingent. They don't need to exist. That means that all of the contingent realities, the things that did not always exist, must have come from somewhere. They must have been caused. So the question then is, are all realities contingent? If so, then every cause has a cause, theoretically infinitely into the past and infinitely into the future. Aristotle says that an infinite regression into the past and the future is not something that we can logically conceive of. It's not something that will ever be containable by the human intellect, and therefore is, by definition, illogical. That's why Aristotle says there needs to be a single necessary first cause or first mover that set this chain of events in motion. Now, take that argument as you will. This is the first of a long and storied process of trying to logically prove the existence of God, and so we must tip our hats to Aristotle, whether or not his argument still holds. Going back to that potential-actual distinction, it's on this basis that we can begin discussing what makes a person good. Not as a good guitar player, but as a good person. What telos does a person have? What is the end goal of humanity? According to Aristotle, it is eudaimonia, which basically means happiness, good-spiritedness, something like that. Basically, we're meant to be happy. He derives this from the fact that no matter what human endeavor we imagine, every human endeavor, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, is done because people want to be happy. Nothing we do has any other object if we follow it far enough. Therefore, we can look to a person's attributes, again, those other causes, formal, material, efficient, and decide what is it about a person that is well-suited or is not well-suited to achieving happiness. And then what makes a good person is to pursue those attributes as clearly and as doggedly as we can. We have a word for that, for the pursuit of good qualities. That's virtue. And it's in Aristotle's Ethics, specifically his Nicomachean Ethics, that Aristotle sets forward his treatise on the subject of virtue. Virtue is both potential and actual, and the potential and actual are reciprocal. Let's put it this way. If I pursue virtuous actions, then that gives me the habit of virtuous disposition. And if I'm virtuously disposed, I'm more likely to commit virtuous actions, and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. Aristotle's definition of virtue depends on this reciprocity between virtuous deeds and virtuous disposition. These virtues include Plato's 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice. Aristotle adds a few more that don't seem quite as fundamental. He says magnanimity and gentleness and wisdom. However, all of these virtues, whether they are the cardinal or Aristotle's kind of bonus virtues, can all be described as a golden mean. That's the word he uses for it. In other words, they need to be not the absolute and unlimited pursuit of some goal, but rather a moderation between some deficit and some excess. Fortitude, for example, is doing what one must. That means doing any less than what one must is a vice, cowardice, but also doing any more than what one must. That would be rashness. The same is true of temperance. Temperance, the not doing of what one mustn't do, can also be done in deficit, that would be prodigality, but can also be done in excess, vicious austerity. This golden means-based virtue of Aristotle might seem to fly in the face of Christian virtue, where there's no such thing as an excess of faith in God or hope or love of God. But that's because faith and hope and love, as far as Aristotle is concerned, are not necessarily virtues if their object is not an infinite good. For example, an excessive faith in a worldly leader, an excessive hope in a worldly event, or an excessive love of a worldly person is not a universally virtuous thing, because none of those things, pursued ad infinitum, could be considered a reliable source of perfect human eudaimonia. Therefore, even Christian treatments on virtue in the scholastic period include the 4 cardinal virtues with the qualification that they depend on that golden mean, whereas the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, depend on excess, in fact, infinity, because their object is infinite. That is why medieval philosophy includes the four cardinal virtues of Plato and Aristotle, because they describe terrestrial things which do exist in a mean, whereas the theological virtues, whose object is God, an infinite, can be pursued to the infinite. Aristotle leaves us some room for love in his virtue system, because as far as Aristotle is concerned, love is not a feeling, not a thinking. It's the drawing towards the beloved, the drawing towards the object, and what are humans doing but drawing towards their happiness? And so practically all human efforts can be described as love relationships of a sort. He splits love into various kinds or categories. These kinds are famously categorized by C.S. Lewis in The Four Loves. I admit, I kind of disagree with the categories that C.S. Lewis provides, merely because they overlook a small but important distinction between two of them. As dangerous as it is to disagree with C.S. Lewis in certain circles, I'm going to split the loves into three different categories, because that really highlights that deficit versus excess basis of Aristotelian virtue. Aristotle's first love is eros. Eros we typically think of as romantic love or sensual love, but mechanically it's merely a love of the other for one's own sake. Anyone I love or anything I love, and pursue the good of in a way that rewards me far more than it rewards them. This is similar to his philautia, which literally means self-love, which obviously is a pursuit of one's own ends. The second love would be philia, which is typically thought of as the love between friends or associates. Now, this love is a love of the other, again, but that benefits oneself and the other. There's mutual benefit to this love relationship. I would include storge, another love that he cites, as part of this category, because storge would be the love one has for family members or people that have some sort of formal relationship with the subject. Again, this is typically a relationship that involves some kind of mutual benefit, and therefore is quite similar to philia. The third love would be agape. This we typically think of as selfless love. This one's pretty easy to understand. It is a love of the other that benefits the other and does not benefit the self. The Christian philosopher is most likely to consider agape as the foremost of these loves, as the purest love. Aristotle, however, does not. Remember, Aristotle's virtue is all based on a golden mean, nothing in excess, nothing in deficit. And so to him, philia, the friend relationship, a relationship of love that is mutually beneficial, is the ideal love. Anything that is beneficial to the other at one's own expense, or beneficial to oneself at the other's expense, is necessarily imbalanced and therefore imperfect. There's another love that defies easy definition. It's xenia, which is the ancient Greek sacred guest-host relationship. It was paramount in ancient society that a foreigner could sojourn in a strange house, and the next morning both the guest and the host would part ways better off than they started. On one hand, that sounds a lot like philia, a mutual benefit, where both of them get something out of the arrangement. Indeed, it's true. But remember, foreignness, strangeness, to Aristotle would suggest something about their properties, something about their essences. A Greek and a barbarian are not quite the same kind of person to Aristotle. An Athenian host entertaining a Persian guest, two people unlike in nature, is necessarily a sort of sacrifice of each type to the other. So it's mutual, like philia, but it's almost a mutual agape, a mutual sacrifice, without which the virtuous conduct between peoples is impossible. Speaking of right conduct between individuals, it's Aristotle's Politics that are perhaps the first philosophical expression that man is political, that man is disposed to civilization, that it is in his nature to seek the society of other men. Therefore, civilization is in fact the natural state of man, and not some mere artificial construct. This is consistent with Aristotle's teleology because we see in man certain attributes that suit him for interacting with other people. The rational mind, the capacity for speech, something unique in man compared to the animals, clearly suggests that interacting with people and socializing with people is such a distinctly human trait that any conception of human eudaimonia without those things is by and large illogical. As obvious as that might seem, you've likely heard the word social construct thrown around a lot as some kind of artificial contrivance or constriction on the natural state of man. Now, a particular civilization may have parts that are poorly suited for human happiness. However, by and large, civilization does have some pretty consistent properties, and that consistency is evidence, not proof, but evidence, that those properties might be an integral part of how society fulfills human happiness. Now, you may say that individuals, and states for that matter, might not be very good judges of how to pursue happiness. And you're right. So what makes one state better than another at identifying the correct course for the betterment of its people? Well, different modes of government. Aristotle identifies 6 different kinds of government and ranks them according to their ability to accomplish human welfare. Therefore, if human happiness depends on human virtue, then the good state is one that disposes humans to virtue. Aristotle identifies 6 governments. 3 are the sort of cardinal, essential governments, and another 3 are the degraded or sort of depleted versions of those governments. The first of them is rule by one, which we would probably call monarchy. Now, rule of one might degrade into a lesser form, which he calls tyranny. The second government would be rule by many, or rule by some. That would be a republic. A degraded republic might turn into the oligarchy. Finally, there's the rule by all, which would be a constitutional government, which, according to Aristotle, the degraded version of which is democracy. I should pause to say that whereas we think of democracy as a democratic republic, what Aristotle's talking about is an Athenian democracy, literally direct rule by all people. On either end of this system, we have a different form of selection for power. Basically, how are we going to decide how power is exercised? On the side of monarchy, we have the power of selection. In other words, how do we decide out of all the people that are in this country, which one gets to call the shots? Now, the most extreme form of this selection would be the selection of exactly one individual, that being monarchy. But theoretically, less selective systems might select, again, rule by many or rule by few, an assembly, a republic. On the other side, you have the power of aggregation, which is the allowance of multiple people to arrive at an average conclusion using the form of a vote. The purest and most extreme version of this, of course, would be direct democracy, where the entire population's net total of ideas is consolidated into a single policy decision. Now, of course, if this is done to any lesser degree, if there's any selection applied to this voting principle, then that total, that rule by all, becomes again a rule by many or few. Again, a republic. You probably see where I'm going with this. The only government that allows for both the selective power of monarchy, again, figuring out who should be in charge and who should not be in charge, but also the aggregating power of a democracy, mollifying the more extreme quirks of any individual ruler by choosing things by majority, is a republic, where some selection is involved in choosing who is in charge, but aggregation helps us determine what they decide. You see, a monarchy depends entirely on the virtue of a single man. If you luck out and get a good king, you've got a good kingdom for the time being. Whereas a democracy depends on the virtue of 50% plus one of its citizens. Any fewer than that, and the people are by and large going to make bad choices, and therefore lead a bad democracy. A republic mitigates both possible risks. In other words, it overcomes both significant likelihoods that some defect of virtue in the people is going to affect the goodness of the state. But it is not immune. It's entirely possible that your republic might not have the good leaders it needs, either because they're not selected or because there are too few good men. The antidote to both is education. Aristotle says that it is the responsibility of the state to educate its men in virtue, without whom the existence of the state is imperiled, whether it's a republic, a democracy, a monarchy, or otherwise. Alas, Aristotle does not proffer a solution for this extension of the problem, though his thesis on virtue offers us some healthy and desirable analogues. And indeed, Aristotle's thesis provides us with perhaps the most comprehensive, the most universal treatment of the knowable world, from the liberation of Plato's forms into immanent essences, from the expansion of those essences into their causes, especially their telos, their final cause, from the telos of man sprouting into his cultivation of virtue, and from virtue being the test and the proof of the greatest of civilizations. The work of Aristotle will live long past the burning of the Lyceum. It'll rise again in the form of the medieval scholastics, in the early humanists, and beyond. Until then, Greece is on the decline. Philosophy is going to go to a dark and very, very weird place, until eventually, and finally, the torch will be taken up again in Rome. But we will leave our discussion of the post-Socratics for another time. Until then, I am John Christensen. Fare thee well.